Hi, thank you very much for joining us today. This is Dave from Schoharie Crossing. You're the audience, and you are tuning in for a fantastic program, Converging on the Canal. I'm really excited about this. It's going to be a lot of fun, and honestly, I've been looking forward to this one for quite some time. Our presenters, Valerie Balint as the program manager for Historic Artist Homes and Studios, a program for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, a nationwide consortium of 44 member sites that were the home and working studios of American artists. She is the author of the newly released Guide to Historic Artists, Homes, and Studios, released by Princeton Architectural Press in June of 2020. She has previous experience on the curatorial staff of Frederick Church's Olana, Chesterwood, and the Freiling-Husen Morris House and Studio. It was at Olana that she began her research on historic foodways. She is a frequent lecturer and writer on preserved artist spaces and American art and social history of the mid-19th and early 20th century. She is a classically and formally trained cook. She served as a New York State coordinator of Save Outdoor Sculpture, a program of the Smithsonian American Art Museum to document all public sculpture in the United States. She holds her MA in Public History from the State University of Albany, New York. Our other presenter is Amanda Massie, a curator with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, which serves 37 historic sites which encompass the state's history. She works on exhibitions team, develops furnishing plans, and provides research support for staff at the sites. She lectures regularly on food history and supervises the program that produces period clothing for site interpreters. Both of these two are fantastic presenters. We had them at the site a couple years ago, presenting on a slightly similar topic, but there was in person and there was food and it was fantastic. And again, that's why I am very excited about this program. So with that, Amanda and Val, please take it away.
Okay, I've been unmuted. Thank you so much, David and Schoharie Crossing, for inviting us back. Valerie and I did a talk at Schoharie Crossing in person a couple of years ago. We had a lot of fun. And it just is a really important moment for us in our historic foodways journey. And so it's exciting to be back and revisit this. As David mentioned, Valerie and I both worked in the past with historic house museums, and that's how we got to foodways. So in addition to Valorie's formal training, I am also just a home cook, but enjoy cooking. And so we both really welcomed the opportunity to work with historic foodways. And what we found as we started to lecture is that foodways are a vehicle to cover major points of history in a way that is fun and relatable. So our past talks have included food demo. We really love that, but we can't do that now. So I hope you have some snacks and enjoy our journey through food. And hopefully I can make the slides go forward. My computer is freezing. Of course it is, because it's every talk has to have some technical difficulties right now. All right.
All right, let me know if you can get that going. Sometimes through this.
There we go. I'll use that. There's a little
there
arrow
we go. There
I thought I could use my arrows on my computer, but didn't. Okay, so here's just me, Val, presenting. There's Olana, and this is the first site, which is the Stephen Harriet Myers House in Albany, which is the home of a abolitionist who worked on the Underground Railroad. It was his home for a number of years. So my research started there into what would an 1850s kitchen in Albany of a middle-class Black family be serving. And Valerie worked at the beautiful home of Frederick Church, which is Olana. And so we then merged our research together. But what's really exciting is when we started at Schoharie Crossing with that talk, we saw how the Erie Canal impacted food. And honestly, we kind of ignored it prior to that, which was kind of embarrassing. But now it's been a major part of the way that we approach foodways in New York. The canal impacted the American diet because at the canal, food, technology, transportation, and information converge. And they move throughout New York State, but really the canal is what reaches the western part of our country and comes back, ending in New York City. So for tonight, we'd like to look at this same period, but with a new lens. We want to take the emphasis off the technology and innovation that we usually focus on in our talks, and we want to shift it towards the people who work to produce food. This means that every level of food. So we want to look into who's growing the food, who processes the food, who's shipping the product, and also selling it, and then who's putting it on the table, who's cooking. By emphasizing the human aspect of food, we want to take this opportunity, which is what New York State Parks has been doing for many years now, to really make a conscious effort to incorporate back into the historic narrative people who have been overshadowed by prominent historic figures. So we want to create a little more balance in the narrative, specifically marginalized people groups who have been overlooked or who leave less evidence in archives and all that. So Foodways allows us to do this pretty easily in that everybody is eating food. There's so many different types of people involved in the production of food. And so we get to look and really, so every race, every social strata is involved. You can move forward. Before we jump into those people, we want to give you a little bit of context for what we're talking about. And you know, not everybody remembers their high school history class. So when we talk about what food influenced by the canal, we want to remind you of the forces that are impacting our nation at the time. So we're really a very new nation in 1825 when the canal opens. The American Revolution, and then followed by the War of 1812, has settled border disputes, and a series of what would now be understood as questionable land dealings with Indian nations in New York has opened the western part of our state. The Revolutionary War ends in 1783. The War of 1812 ends in 1814, and right in between those wars, we had the Louisiana Purchase. So our nation is growing in size and is changing so significantly, but is much more well established by 1825. And they are anxious to get to the western part of our country. So the Erie Canal makes that possible. And the other thing that's happening at this time is that they're really trying to define what it means to be American. So you're a nation that's only a few decades old and has experienced enormous amounts of change and just trying to become a stable place. You see a lot of that ambition and that growth becomes part of the identity. So here is just a little glimpse of where the energy in our nation is funneled into. So in addition to land settlement, it's also put into the Industrial Revolution, which starts in England, but gains momentum in our nation at the end of the 18th century. And though interrupted by war, Americans start to move from farms into urban areas. And so just a little glimpse of how that changes is, for example, in 1790, only 1 in 20 people lived in an urban area. But by 1870, 1 in 4 people are living in an urban area. And you see these cities are growing up often around mills, which are usually connected to water because that is their power source. So the Industrial Revolution offered many opportunities for a young nation and created massive innovation. The steam engine alone created different new ways to travel. It improved factories, making work more efficient and goods cheaper. So one little glimpse of just how much change was happening technologically in our country is that the patents that were issued. So again, I'm throwing lots of numbers. I promise this will not will not just be numbers thrown at you throughout. But from 1790 until 1836, only 5,500 patents were issued. about 119 per year, compared with 1836 to 1900, when 640,166 patents were issued a year. So 10,000 patents per year are being issued in the latter part of the century. So, and just tons of experimentation is definitely happening in foodways. And Val's going to talk a little bit more about that later. But the place that this, I think, is just most obvious is right here at the hearth. So at the beginning of the century, this is where people would have been cooking. And they'd been cooking at a hearth for hundreds, if not hundreds of years for sure. It hadn't changed how people are cooking. Much of the cooking equipment has looked the same for hundreds of years. And it's hot, heavy work. You're often stooped over to do much of that work. You're lifting heavy cast iron, earthenware, copper pots and pans. And you're also hauling a lot of water to be heated, whether it's for cooking, for cleaning, or for laundry. So the need to improve upon this was great. Also, just to make a note that most middle-class households in the United States could afford to have at least one servant or enslaved person, which would have likely influenced the cooking happening in the household. Even if they weren't doing the main part of the cooking, they would have been contributing to that. And this is where we went. So by the 1840s, most middle-class households are installing stoves into their houses, like more like the one on the lower left, and depending on the size of the household. And this required women to relearn how to cook. So you hear a lot of complaints in accounts from this period that food tastes differently. And you can kind of think about food grilled on the fire, like in a grill, or food cooked in a stove. It's a really big difference in flavor. But people adjust because it really just makes sense. The cook stove is more efficient and cooks can stand more upright. And eventually stoves also develop an attachment that keeps water hot all the time when the stove is hot. And throughout the 19th century, you also get a shift in who's cooking in the kitchen. More and more immigrants are coming into our country. And so you might have a different immigrant group represented in the kitchen. Just to point out, just to pause for a moment, that because the kitchen on the left is just my favorite kitchen of all of my sites. And that's because it just shows all the change of the 19th century. You have the original hearth and you've got the range stuck into it. You can see right next to it, you see the bake ovens. There's a coffee grinder on the wall, which throughout the 19th century, people are trying to improve upon in new patents. You see it in Sears catalogs and all those places. And then even if you look in the back, I think there's some glassware. So all these different representations of technology that changed in the 19th century is represented in this kitchen, and just gives a nice visual for how things changed. And I'm going to hand it over to Val, and she's going to talk more about the canal.
Great. Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, everyone, for having us here tonight. So I'm going to talk about how the canal changed food particularly. The canal changed food through a series of interconnected threads that were both direct and indirect. And fundamentally, the canal allowed for ease of transport of both raw and finished product and goods through the canal corridor and beyond, both to the west and to the north. This cut transportation costs by 95%. And I just want you to sort of absorb that number. We're all kind of aware, I think, of the things coming into our home right now, since many of us are at home. Think about a 95% deduction in whatever those costs might be. And it allowed for the transport of larger amounts of product by any one supplier, but it also enabled economic transport of goods that were inherently more expensive, either in their production or their acquisition. And as a result, numerous areas around the canal grew to foster production of various food products on grand scale, at times supplying the nation with the lion's share of specific products. from cheese to salt to flour, and we will discuss some of those in this presentation. The canal also advantaged New York City ports over others, thereby securing a prominent food supply chain really still felt today. At its peak in 1855, there were 33,000 commercial transactions taking place. The canal also enabled cost-effective transport of commercial equipment required for large-scale production, both agriculture and factory-based, and it transformed the lives in everyday kitchens, as stoves, like the one that Amanda showed, could be shipped outward from manufacturing towns into everyday homes. But there were also indirect influences on food culture. The canal transformed businesses while also transforming towns along its route. And cities sprang up that were once very small towns, and even small villages expanded, not only to meet the demands of the expanding population and industry, but also to meet the demands of tourism, which was an integral part on the canal. Grocers, taverns, and hotels all along the corridor were needed to provide foodways infrastructure and to support economies for local townsfolk, business interests, and visitors. And in many ways, it altered the way people looked at cities forever. They became symbols of achievements of our nation, but also as places to travel and to enjoy for the many sites and activities that they had to offer. And of course, everywhere along the way, you had to eat. Can you go to the next slide, Amanda? So the comparison of the canal and rail transport, I think, is a wonderful illustration of how history is not linear. The transformation of the rail system happens alongside the canal and begins very shortly after the canal first opens. In February 1827, the first train departs from Baltimore to Ohio. By Christmas 1830, there's the journey of the nation's first mechanized passenger train in South Carolina. Begun during the Civil War, but completed in 1869, the first transcontinental railroad, over 1,900 miles of track, connected the existing Eastern rail network with the Pacific coast. In general, rail travel impacted relative costs and transport speed as compared to the Erie Canal, but one critical invention transforms the food industry forever, and you're looking at it kind of right now. It's the refrigerator boxcar. The first car traveled between Chicago and Boston in 1868, but by the 1880s, these were coming from much farther west than Chicago. Scientific methods for raising, slaughtering, and shipping begin now. And there's a shift from transporting live animals to slaughtering before transport. And I just want you to imagine what this does to the cost of all kinds of meats. Chicago had the largest slaughterhouses in the world, Union stockyards, 1 week alone in December 1864, 7,000, what they called beeves, were transported to New York City. Yet despite these increased advantages of the railroad, the canal is not really eclipsed until the 20th century. They are really going along on parallel tracks. The next slide, Amanda. I feel like I'm Vanna White a little. The next slide, Amanda. The result of this increased mobility of food goods at such deeply reduced cost while still guaranteeing freshness is reflected in the 1870s painting you see on the screen. This is of a market in New York City. Look closely at what you see here. Deep on the left side of this image, you see whole sides of meat. Many cookbooks in the 19th century contain copious receipts using beef. This is not about family livestock. Many Americans are now buying their meat from their butcher. The boxcar has made it economical enough for frequent purchase. Now, further forward in the painting, amid the more commonplace watermelon and cantaloupes, you see more exotic bananas and pineapples and avocados, which in the 19th century are known as alligator pears, which always makes me smile. It's such a funny name. Canal routes provided the access by which Western cities in New York and beyond could procure these items. And they begin to show up in cookbooks, recipes, and menus. Exotic foods are now within economic reach and at various times of the year. It's why a woman all the way out in Rochester can serve oysters, oranges, and figs to her guests in March of 1884. None of that product is local. It's all being shipped to her. The objects used in display and serving food were also impacted by the canal. Glassware, china, and other tableware were cheaper to purchase both because of industrialization and because of transport. Imported wares from China and later Japan find their way even to the smallest town purveyors. Next slide. Alongside transport advances, there were major breakthroughs in food preservation. These innovations were employed by families, but also large-scale manufacturing, providing both easier packing and longer shelf life for perishable products. It also allowed for mass production of product with consistency of result. It highlights two contrasting aspects of the consumer market, a desire for fresh foods from farther away, but also these new modern preservation methods. And there are all kinds of articles about how the scientific processes of these were perceived in some ways to be healthier for the consumer. Pectin is isolated in 1825, allowing for preservation of fruit through jams and jellies. Later, Charles Knox introduces the world's first granulated gelatin, and Pearl Waite, and later his wife May, develop at Leroy. I think it's Leroy and not Leroy. I went back and forth all day. What we know today as Jell-O, which is still the most popular dessert in the world. The mason jar, which we still use today, was invented and patented in 1858. It's a molded glass jar used primarily in home canning to preserve food, and it was thicker than previously produced jars. Gradually, by new products and methods, came in commercial canning, which really replaced these kinds of mason jars. At the turn of the century, a company out of New York patented the double seam process in modern food cans. This process is capable of sealing more than 2,000 cans a minute. Other innovations in this period included the creation of baking soda, the first creation of baking powder, and in 1891, the Imperial Packing Company, which then became Beechnut Packing, patented the vacuum seal jar and produced a vast array of products, including peanut butter, chili sauce, macaroni, and chewing gum. And these innovations and others led to the advances in scaling up product while also increasing the variety of products sought by individual households, either already preserved or fresh product purchased with knowledge that the shelf life could be extended through home preservation. Next slide. And then there's the print media. And there's this sort of connectivity between print media, travel, and consumerism. Print media will both influence taste and react and reflect evolving realities throughout the 19th century. The slide we just saw featured widespread advertising targeted at the middle class for products related to food production and consumption. That was a single page from Rochester Business Directory promoting canned goods from 3 separate purveyors on one advert. The growing industry of printing household manuals and cookbooks, like you see on the left, recommended how you should keep a household, what to acquire, how to present things in your house. And your table and the goods on it became an expression of your class, your sophistication, and your modernity. And there was an enticement in these print publications for acquisition of increasingly codified donning accoutrement. Grape scissors, berry spoons, celery vases, and instruction on how to arrange these items and what best foods to serve. And these filtered down all the way down to everyday living at respective income levels. But printing media also reflected the growing interest in middle class use of their income for leisure travel. And these were richly illustrated and highly narrative guidebooks that informed the potential traveler about all the riches excursions beyond their home had to offer, while also providing vital suggestions about where to stay and where to eat when you were embarking on these journeys. This is an early example on the right. Northern Traveler, first published by Theodore Dwight in 1826. It's known to have been extensively used by Alexander Stuart Scott on his own canal journey that same year, and his experience has been brought to light by the recent publication of his travel diary. These types of guides were instrumental in not only enticing people to travel, but in assisting with planning every detail of the trip. For example, in 1873, the very well-known Appleton's Journal featured hotels that welcomed female diners, critical information for the increasing number of women who were actually traveling alone. You're the next slide. Oh, done. Next slide. It's easier when we're in the same room, for sure. That's your slide, Amanda.
Ah, thank you. Thank you, David. Sorry, this back and forth is challenging. So thank you, Valerie. We've covered some of the major changes impacting food thanks to the innovation of the 19th century. But what we really want to do, I know that was like, I feel like I need to take a breath after, after speeding through the 19th century. We want to talk about the people that were involved in this. And so here's just a glimpse of some representations of people. The one on the right is a group from a factory in Rochester, I think. Oh no, it was in Auburn. But it was a yarn factory. Well, you can use yarn in cooking, so we can like really kind of try and relate it. But it's just meant to be a representation. And what we wanted to do is, I kind of got piqued, my interest was piqued in this because I've been doing research for another site of mine about immigration in the 19th century. And it just got me thinking, there's so many stereotypes related to immigration in New York. If you learn New York's history, you're certain that this people group built the canal and this people group did this. And so I really was kind of curious as to what was really happening. And I think, and so we just started to dig into the records for that. So, but before I start that, I wanted to point out that in 1825, when the canal opens, there is still enslavement in New York. And manumission was not complete until 1827. And there are accounts of even into the 1830s of people, there's records that survive of people finally manumitting their enslaved people in the 1830s. So New York, I think a lot of people are surprised that there was even slavery in New York because it's sort of been overshadowed by other parts of the country. But because slavery was still in place in 1825, it's very likely that enslaved people were involved in food production along the canal. And this is my colleague Travis Bowman, who's done a lot of research into this, has made a graph for 1790 to give you an idea of the percentage of households that had slaves. So a lot of people think about slavery in New York and they say, well, it was only 10% of the population, and they think that's very small. And true, that's partially true. But when you think about the number of households that had an enslaved person in them, this is 1790, you get some like New Utrecht, which I think is Long Island, but had 75% of the households, but more in areas, I think Schoharie, it's 20%. These are, I think, not German flats, and a Jahiri, it's 5% of households. But the house in the picture is the Van Alstyne house, which I think is near Canajahiri, and they had enslaved people. So just a reminder that there were enslaved people in New York. They've been in New York since the early in the 17th century. And the thing to remember also is that when the canal opens, and even when they are freed, they didn't just poof and disappear. These are people that were settled in this area. They were likely born in this area. And so a lot of them were contributing to the industry along the canal. The Erie Canal was also part of the Underground Railroad, which, if you're not familiar with that, it's a place, it was a system for freedom seekers to find refuge. Once they were in New York, freedom seekers often found jobs along the canal. And we know for certain that former enslaved were used to build the locks in Lockport. They likely became stewards, waiters, cooks, and even firemen along the canal. And we do see, and this is what I found in my other research as well, that there's kind of an absence of free blacks in factories. And I think that we're sort of finding, we're trying to find more evidence for this, but that we think that factory owners generally preferred to use white laborers, and so they really were proponents of this massive immigration, often pushing for it. There was a bill passed during the Civil War to encourage immigration. So preferring white labor to African Americans. So we see African Americans going into specific industries, often service industries. We see them as waiters and stewards, cooks, and specifically barbers. There's quite a number of barbers throughout New York. One of the most well-known conductors on the Underground Railroad is a man named William Wells Brown, who lived in Buffalo. He escaped slavery in Missouri by way of Cleveland, and then settled in Buffalo and became a crew member on an Lake Erie steamer, in which he then used to help freedom seekers get to Canada. He then became one of the first African American novelists. And Val is going to continue with who built the canal.
So who built the canal? Many were Irish and German immigrants, as well as local farmers and populations of newly free African Americans. There were cries for native-born Americans to do this work, but the vast majority was actually done by immigrant labor. The Irish had experience building canals in the British Isles and France. Some of the Irish labor was actually recruited while they were still in their native land. Ads were actively placed in Catholic and local papers throughout Ireland. And often those who took up the call signed contracts before passage. Therefore, their employment and travel constituted a cost to their employer, and workers needed to clear their debt. Others were solicited by American published Irish newspapers like the Shamrock in New York City. And workers were enticed by the promise of meat 3 times a day, plenty of bread and vegetables with a reasonable amount of liquor. And I'm quoting from the Shamrock right now, and $8, $10, and $12 a month, or $12 a month for wages. And there was a whiskey ration. Annual reports from the Canal Commission do not actually outline the ethnicity of workers, but it's notable that in the 1818 report, there's a mention of a crew of 3 Irishmen. That's a typical number for the team that completed over 240 yards of the canal in 16.5 days. And one can presume that was notable accomplishment in order for it to be singled out. And they were paid 12 cents per cubic yard. By contrast, the original engineers who were hired to survey were native-born primarily. Workers also then went on to establish routes in nearby towns, both, which would then grow even more after the canal was completed. And this directly impacted the need for food-related infrastructure, both during and after the build. And that involved groceries, taverns, and other foodstuff purveyors. There was another population who was considered for work for the canal. In 1817, legislation was passed to use prison labor if necessary. And I actually found one account of 30 convicts from Auburn prison working 16 months to build the aqueduct in Rochester. But one important reference and sort of unexpected reference struck me relative to African-American contributions to the canal. On the right is DeWitt Clinton's burial monument in Brooklyn. DeWitt Clinton, synonymous with the canal. I'm an art historian at my core, and so I look at these objects for clues. On the central panel are a series of figures related to the canal, and one of them is an African-American man. As opposed to much African-American imagery, this is not a man bent or in chains. He is standing on par with other figures in scale and prominence. And a fellow art historian, Karen Lemmy, commented, he's not sleeping, he's not depicted in the vein of the minstrels, he's not in a position of supplication. He is an active person and an active part of the commerce and wealth created by the Erie Canal. And it just goes to show you that historical references can come from very unexpected sources. Next slide. So, I'm just going to mention very briefly immigration in general. It had come to a standstill between 1793 and 1815 for a wide variety of reasons: the French Revolution, a federalist policy that extended the period of between residence and citizenship to 14 years, and the War of 1812. There was a revival after 1815, and after 1819, ship captains furnished lists of passengers, which included their age, their sex, their occupation, and their country of origin. Irish immigrants dominated into the early 1840s, and then they were overtaken by Germans. That's an engraving of Germans on your left. And that followed into the 1890s, and immigrants from the United Kingdom consistently placing third place in those percentages. There were certainly immigrants from Western nations, European nations such as France and the Netherlands, and robust immigration from Nordic countries, with Sweden dominating. By the time the 1860s come around, Germany has surpassed Ireland. And in that decade, just under 1 million immigrants come in from each country. But also in the 1880s, immigration from Italy, Russia, and other Eastern European nations start to happen. Of course, nativism was an issue, as seen as the stereotypical cartoon on the right. And in 1854, as the discussion of a bill outlining the territorial government of Kansas and Nebraska, it was contentiously debated about whether what they called know nothing, and you see this in a lot of articles, immigrants should have opportunities to own land. It is actually William Seward who evoked the canal, really positing the implications of what the costs of the canal, but also other achievements in infrastructure would have been if not for immigrant labor. That was one of the cases he was making as this legislation was being discussed. And immigrants and local farmers also built the canal, but this was a massive use of immigrant labor to build what was an incredibly backbreaking engineering feat for during which many died. Amanda.
So we want to take a more specific peek at places throughout New York, and we chose a few different ones. And this is on the lower right, that's Herkimer Homestay Historic Site, and you can see some cows. So after it was the home of General Nicholas Herkimer, it passed through a number of hands, including his brother, his sister-in-law when his brother died, and then some other landowners. And its right position, and you can see the canal from that front door. And then I think this is a painting of Schoharie that's in the Arkell Museum. Just obviously agriculture is still a major part of the Mohawk Valley, and so we wanted to see who was involved in that. We also wanted to look for free Black workers in the area. So it's just a little peek. But we want to also, so we start looking specifically at some cities, and this is just an example. This is Utica in 1807, I think. Sorry, I can't, my windows are blocking. 1807, and it's quite a sleepy little town. And by 1855, we have a booming metropolis. And this is just an example of what many, many cities throughout the Mohawk Valley, all positioned along the canal, would have looked like. Major, major growth in a span of a few decades. And we want to specifically look at Little Falls, which is a neighbor of Utica. And we chose this because it's a city that really was just has a fascinating story. There are many clothing manufacturers and textile mills like in other cities. But what makes Utica, or what makes Little Falls unique, is that it became the capital for cheese. Little Falls is surrounded by what was originally the breadbasket of New York in the 18th century, but the Erie Canal opening made wheat much cheaper and glutted the market with Western wheat that had an earlier harvest date. So by the time the wheat was being harvested in New York, the market was already flooded with wheat from Ohio and other places. And so it just, it made sense for the farmers to shift what they did. So they shifted to dairy farming. And the census records show this. I was looking at one of the 1875 one. There's tons of feed, grasses grown for feed, and lots of cows. And some of the cows were for butchering, but most of them were dairy cows. Little Falls and the surrounding area became known for their cheese, and they started to apply the systems of the Industrial Revolution to cheese production. And Val mentioned earlier that they wanted consistency of product, and they actually wanted to control the price of the cheese. So farmers started essentially like co-ops where they would all bring their milk to one location, and an expert cheesemaker would make the cheese. So that would create the consistency of product. So then once this started happening, they became known for their cheese, and the cheese market was growing. A man named Harry Burrell and others in Little Falls started an open air market in Little Falls, and they started to set the prices for cheese for the whole state and really the country. 10 years, so that was 1861 that they started the open air market, I believe. Yeah, and then 10 years later, they start the New York Dairymen's Association and Board of Trade. And here they are setting the prices for the nation in cheese. And they create a legacy in Little Falls. Burrell's son, David Burrell, stays in the area, works in the dairying business, has his own experimental dairy farm, and he creates lots of improvements to dairy equipment, pasteurization, and gas heaters. Another family that moved from Copenhagen to Little Falls to open a cheese factory, the Frederickson family, they also stay in the area and contribute to the economy into the 20th century. The meetings for this Dairymen's Association were held at the Evans House in Little Falls, and a telegraph line was installed so that prices could be sent to New York City. And this stayed the capital of cheese for many years, but was surpassed by Wisconsin in the 1890s. And the culprit for the surpassing was the refrigerated boxcar. It's all a big cycle that once cheese and beef, because there was a beef industry in the area too. Once this was able to be shipped from the western part of the country, it overpowered the market in Little Falls. But what's really, you see a lot of other industry, but they really were able to pivot again. And there's still tons of dairy farmers. If you are from New York, you know there's tons of dairy farmers still in New York. Yes, Little Falls still has a cheese festival. They really are trying to capitalize on the historic cheese making, but they also started to, so instead of making cheese, they shifted to supplying cream, milk, and cream cheese and butter to the resorts that were in the St. Lawrence area, the Thousand Islands, and the Adirondacks. So they really were able to continue that industry into the 20th century. In Little Falls, there were tons of other people supporting food industries. There's farmers, there's boatmen. So I went through the census records for 1875, all of them for Little Falls, and found lots of different people, really interesting, kind of just snippets of stories, because the census records only gives you a little bit, but really wanted to focus also. I included boatmen, people working along the canal. I found one specific African-American family, Anne and Charles Carpenter. It's a mother and son living in Little Falls, both born in the area. And Charles is only 15, but he's working as a saloon waiter in Little Falls. And his mother is widowed and does not seem to have employment, which is pretty typical for a woman in 1875. So it might mean that she may have been recently widowed and so isn't working, but it seems like Charles is supporting the family. We also find in the neighboring Montgomery County, there is a family, the Bakeman family, that Henry Bakeman gained his freedom from enslavement by serving in the Revolutionary War, and then built started a cooper shop, ran a ferry, and purchased a farm in that area. And his family both settled in that area, his children, and then moved to other parts of New York as well, and running farms, and contributed to, you know, there's some of his grandchildren were in the Union Army in the Civil War. So they're an active presence in Western New York. And I also saw lots of other immigrant groups represented. It was still mostly people born in New York, mostly New York or other parts of the US, but there were quite a few English, Irish, Scottish, German, and Canadians as well represented in those industries. I didn't look specifically at every single farmer because I would have spent the rest of my life going through all the farmers in Little Falls. So I took a sampling of farmers, but looked at all the other food related industries. And so that was really fascinating, but there's a lot more work to do looking further into some of those folks. I'm going to move to my other sample city, the Salt City, which is Syracuse and the surrounding area. Syracuse, and nearby Salina and Liverpool had salt deposits that were used prior to even European contact. The Onondaga Nation was boiling salt and trading with European traders in the mid-19th century, and the U.S. gained that area in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1788, and they actually New York made it the Onondaga Salt Springs Reservation for 1 mile surrounding the lower part of Onondaga Lake, because they knew how important the salt was. And I guess in the treaty, it specified that they had to produce salt for common use of everyone. So the salt springs really created the industry in that area around salt. And for example, Syracuse doubled in population between 1850 and 1870. This being a large contributor, the canal being a large contributor, and there's lots of other industry happening in Syracuse. Alexander Scott, who Valerie mentioned, and our friend published his journal, mentions Salina, and it sounds like he's quoting almost directly from a travel journal in his account of Salina. He visits the extensive salt works, wants to see it even though it's raining, and he sees a half mile of wells that are 8.5 by 12 feet wide. I'm going to skip because you get to see these wells where they pump 15,000 to 20,000 gallons of water per day, pass through here to yield 16 to 25 ounces of salt per gallon. And in 1823, 696,000 bushels of salt came from this area to yield $87,000 of revenue for the state. So also in all the salt that was created in this area, the state got a duty from, I think, each bushel sold. So it's mentioned again by another travel writer, Colonel William Stone, who was a fairly popular author in his time, and he gives just a little bit better description of how the salt fields look. He said there are hundreds of acres of fields covered with vats for solar evaporation. The salt comes from great fountains. One in particular, he predicted, will supply the existing works and many more, which was true. It really functioned into the early 20th century. And the machines that moved the water were powered by the Oswego Canal, just a connecting canal. So he also mentions how the village just grew up. He grew up in New York and had been in Salina in 1820, but he said that by 1829, when he's visiting, it now contains large, well-built stores, warehouses, handsome streets, and dwellings, and 3 or 4 beautiful churches, including a neat edifice belonging to the Roman Catholics, which is quite significant given the immigrants that came to work in Salina. And Salina, in contrast with Little Falls, which I found still predominantly native-born people, there were more in the salt industry and the food-related food industries who were from Germany than anywhere else. So I think a lot of those people coming in, possibly who had worked on the canal, Irish, Germans, came and settled in this area. There's also a big basket making industry from willow trees, which was super interesting. But so in addition to textiles mills, and farming. They also have this salt industry, the willow bark. Sorry, I'm finding my spot. I also saw very few women employed, though I think later in the century there were women. There's a photo in the state archives of women packing salt. So they might have been involved in more specific parts that were appropriate for the mills here. And you just see the area growing, just like Colonel Stone's account. I saw 6 hotels supporting travelers along the canal. Obviously, this salt is shipped likely along the canal. And yeah, Val's going to talk about our next city.
So in 1823, the town of Rochesterville numbered 2,500 residents, and only 7 years later, the population had exploded to almost 10,000, and it was soon rechartered as a city. It was known as the Young Lion of the West, and then as the Flower City. It was by 1838 the largest flour producing city in the nation, and the canal made the transport of that product in high volume possible. By 1870, the mills were manufacturing 5,000 barrels a day. That's almost 2 million a year. But over time, kind of like the cheese industry, it was co-opted as agriculture and population moved west, and kind of like that same area, Rochester needed to pivot. And so it also soon became the home of extensive nurseries, giving rise to the city's second nickname, which was the Flower City again, but this time with an OW. And the entire city was ringed with large and small nurseries. And the most famous was actually started by 2 immigrants from these major immigrant populations that we've been discussing, George Ellwanger from Germany and Patrick Barry from Ireland. Later still, the city became a confectionery hub. And this is a fact that Amanda found while researching for this talk. Joseph Demarath was the first confectioner in America to commercially distribute marshmallows beginning in 1895 in Rochester. But who was in Rochester? The next slide, Amanda. You know, this was a booming town, and there were many different types of occupations beyond the industries that we were just talking about. By the 1890s, Rochester was the 4th largest textile producer in the country, and employed tons of skilled craftsmen. Mary Bragdon, who you see on the bottom left, settled in Rochester with her family at the age of 24, and she had a series of office jobs, including positions at Warner's Safe Cure Company and the Cutler Manufacturing Company, and ultimately became an executive secretary. And her preserved diaries and photographs, another nod to a Rochester industry, can be found online, and they offer a glimpse into what were the rising professional opportunities for women emerging in prosperous cities on the canal. But slightly earlier census records indicate that many women were employed as housekeepers, domestics, and cooks, and it's hard to know if these were in private homes or in the growing hospitality industry. Other census snapshots record mere laborers, painters, one assumes these were building painters, grocers, and clerks, and a reference to the profession that Amanda's already discussed, which is African-American barbers. George Hamilton was one such barber who lived with his mother, Mary, who was listed as a housekeeper, and a boarder, Sarah Thompson, who was listed as a cook. In this very same ward, which was very close to downtown, Charles Lauder was an African-American baker, and Charles Renier, who was the district attorney, both resided in the same ward. These individuals really represent the wide range of employment that is required at this time to keep a thriving city going at the third quarter of the century. It's really important to remember that Rochester was the center of reform movements, abolition and women's rights, and that more exploration really needs to be done about how opportunities for women and African Americans in Rochester may or may not have differed to other cities along the canal. It's not a surprise that the city boasts early 20th century architecture by some of the first professional, both female and African American architects. And like Little Falls, Falls, Rochester had numerous listings for hotel keepers and hotel clerks, such as Wesley Crouch at Whitcomb House. And these hotels, which increasingly became known as palaces of the people, served traveling businessmen, but also tourists traveling along the canal as part of the American Grand Tour, which culminated at Niagara Falls. And next to tourism. Tourism, that's the next slide, Amanda. Tourism was a major aspect of travel on the canal. And to have tourism, you need a wealthy middle class to support that industry. You need the promotion of places through printed material, and you need affordable ways to travel. And the Erie Canal certainly provided that. Packet boats like this provided opportunities to travel overnight and dine on board, but also to disembark at various locales to visit, dine, and stay, reboarding on either the same boat or on another boat to continue the journey. Many famous people like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Herman Melville and Mark Twain wrote about their experiences on the canal, as did people like Charles Dickens. But increasingly, diaries like Alexander Stuart Scott that comes to light and is published shine a light on what is normal, sort of everyday personages traveling on the canal and what that's like. In 1825, there were 40,000 tourists on the canal, and these boats were a sort of all-in-one boat, which is at mealtime, the entire cabin became basically the center of eating. And the curtain between what was the woman's cabin in the front was taken down to accommodate a full meal for whoever was on board. In 1835, Hawthorne extolled the virtues of dining on the canal, and a year later, a traveler, Thomas Woodcock, who traveled from Schenectady to Buffalo, said it was always supplied with everything necessary and the best quality. He paid $3.50 for the 80 miles between Schenectady and Utica. And this was $2.50 more than Alexander Scott paid for the same trip a decade earlier. Some boats only cost a cent per mile. And what I want people to understand is, while this was relatively inexpensive, it remained beyond the reach of many Americans. But who was running these boats exactly? The moving of goods and people along the canal involved thousands of boats and crews. In 1845, there were 4,000 boats on the canal operated by 25,000 men, women, and children. Some contemporary accounts refer to the captains of these boats as genteel men, setting them apart from perhaps the rest of the crew. And the Syracuse Standard in 1903 reported that cooks on the boats were largely African American. And certainly this is supported by later evidence among the serving porters on the famous Pullman trains, where they were not only porters, but served as cooks in the train's kitchen. But I think the best example I can give you of what was the difference between working and sort of going down the canal is an 1832 letter by Ethan Salter, whose family lived and operated a boat on the canal. And this is a young boy speaking. Pa says, I'm too small to drive the mules. Mostly I help take care of the mules and help mom with the cooking, which tells you who's doing cooking on this boat. Many of my friends on other canal boats started about age 12 caring for the horses and mules. We have all kinds of passengers. Some are from foreign countries, and many are moving from Vermont and New Hampshire to Western New York or even further west. At one point, we had a man who played the accordion, and the passengers danced on top of the boat until we came to a low bridge, where, of course, then everyone had to drop down. Others just watch the scenery as it goes by, play whist or backgammon, or debate about politics. But here's where it gets interesting. The lock keepers and the shops along the canal often stay open 24 hours. There's also a bum boat that has fresh vegetables and meat. Mom prepares meals for all the passengers who want full board. And this is a reminder of all the necessary industries that supported the canal offices, canal boats, from ticketing offices, but also those providing perishable goods for the taking on board of the boats. And thousands more were employed to maintain and operate the canal itself, including the lock tenders, the toll collectors, bridge operators, surveyors, repair crews, and more. Next slide. But part of the benefit of this type of travel is that you actually got to get off and see places like Salina and visit the great salt mines or the beautiful natural wonders. It was about visiting the natural wonders and the achievements, man-made achievements. Many offered taverns and inns for visitors, and larger cities built very large hotels early on with rooms to accommodate many guests. And these hotels began to include more formal dining rooms. But as early as 1826, Alexander Scott recounts staying in hotels where he could take a meal, take a bath, or overnight among 200 other boarders. And this is not in, these are in towns outside of Rochester and Syracuse, but in some of these smaller cities that also have very, very large hotels. And they needed to accommodate not only travelers, but businessmen as well. And there were eateries, fancy and humble, that were increasingly serving the working population who no longer went home for the midday meal. And at lower right is an example of an informal establishment, which offers simple fare, a la carte. And you can see it's managed by a woman, which is why I picked it, Mrs. Jackson, to whom you must inquire for employment. In fire establishments, cuisine was meant to mirror dining happening in the wealthiest homes in the nations, in hotels like that of the Congress Hotel that you see there. And in the late and 19th and early 20th centuries, women actually still had difficulty being served at these fine restaurants if they arrived without men accompanying them. But other establishments began to cater to women shoppers who wanted lunch, and they opened near dry goods emporiums and the first department stores in the area. And as women in the cities worked in increasing numbers in professional establishments, inexpensive restaurants and confectionery shops where you got to have oysters and ice cream in respectable settings grew up as well. But by the end of the century, we see the combination of industrial growth and its effects. The excess of the Gilded Age is a direct result of the wealth created by railroads and other industries in America. And many of the towns along the canals, such as Syracuse, Rochester, and Niagara Falls, grow to accommodate the demands of that wealth. The hotels become larger and more ornate, overtly mimicking the trappings and decor of European aristocracy. And many of these hotels start to employ French chefs, which was the latest fashion in America's wealthiest household. These chefs were all male, of course, and middle-class visitors to these hotels were then exposed to haute cuisine and reinforced through myriad cookbooks and advanced advice manuals they would have at home, which then gave them instructions on how to emulate this in the everyday middle-class home. But when you talk about the rise of this hotel culture, you're also talking about a huge rise in the need for labor. So who is in the service industry? Women in the early 1800s ran establishments which served men almost exclusively. But as the century wore on, running an eating establishment where alcohol was sold was considered disreputable and unladylike. Throughout the century, women of all races and ethnicities were employed out of sight in commercial kitchens as cooks, kitchen helpers, and dishwashers, and kitchen managers, while men dominated the larger hotel management sphere and the front of the house. Hotel dining rooms were typically staffed by African-American men as waiters, but progressively white immigrant males took over the service presence in restaurant dining rooms, and male chefs took over the most upscale hotel kitchens. But the number of women running restaurants of their own increased in the later 19th century, although more opportunities can be seen the further sort of westerly you go. For example, in 1883, there was a woman who ran a popular restaurant and oyster bar in Indianapolis, and this is just one of many that I found. Women also ran the food service in department stores, including bakeries, candy kitchens, and restaurants, and in the middle-class tea rooms of the sort of the early part of the next century. The Downing family were one of many African-American families that took up the catering trade in free cities. Like undertaking and barbering, catering was a personal service occupation which offered opportunity. Downing opened a successful oyster cellar on Broad Street in New York City, which was incredibly successful in the 1820s and actually grew to include subsequent locations. More research must be done to see if there are similar stories of this type of enterprise by the African-American community along the canal. One story I did find was Jane and Thomas Leonard, who were part of the small African-American community in Syracuse. After migrating from Virginia, they worked basically their entire lives in Syracuse until they died. And I think their story represents what we talk about when we talk about this sort of interconnected labor related to the canal and to food. Thomas worked variously as a waiter, a cartman, a boatman, and a laborer. And Jane worked as the cook at the fairly famous, at that time, Exchange Hotel in Syracuse. And these are the types of stories that we really hope to uncover more as we continue our research. And I think as Amanda's going to sort of wrap up in our last slide, that's really what you're seeing now, is you're seeing us start to examine these questions beyond just knowing what was produced where and when, who this impacted and who was actually doing the labor in what was an incredibly complex series of industries that relied on each other for success. Amanda.
Thank you, Valerie. And thank you guys so much for listening. We always pack our talks in so heavy. We have so much more we even want to say. And so much, but more than anything, I end on this slide. This is 2 shots taken from stereographs from the Thousand Islands region. And you can see that there are African Americans in the photos. And in both, you see people who are able to achieve the ability to go on vacation. One is a little more humble. They're camping. Maybe they're just picnicking for the day, but they have time off. They're together. And the one on the left, though, these people are quite well dressed. And there's a number of views of this group kind of arranged different ways. And in the New York, these are from the New York Public Library. And in some of the entries, they say that they're tourists, and in other ones, they say they're a family with their servants. And what we just don't know. And I think they represent what could be the growing middle class for the African-American middle class. It is a growing, I think of other stories, the Stephen and Harriet Meyer house, which I showed at the very beginning, was my early research in foodways. The house itself was owned by Harriet Meyer's brother, who was successful. I think he owned multiple properties. I think he might have even owned boats on the river. But Stephen Myers, who was an abolitionist and needed time to devote to that, actually worked as a steward going up and down the river. So I think there's so much more to learn. And this is what these slides really represent, that we're just at the beginning of this. There's so many people working on this. Valerie and I are both building on other people's research that we found. But we have so many more questions, and really these slides leave us with a lot of questions, whether these folks are traveling themselves or whether they're traveling with family, and we have a lot of questions about the people we discovered in the census records. We know from some other folks' research that the African-American population in the Mohawk Valley started to decline by the end of the century, which my guess is that people are moving to larger urban areas. You have probably heard of the Great Migration, where I had previously thought of this people from the South moving to northern cities where there's a lot of opportunity, but I think people are also just moving from more rural areas to cities. And so I hope to, in the future, track some of these folks and see if they're moving to Syracuse, Rochester, or Buffalo, or are they moving to Philadelphia or New York City? And so there's a lot left to come. And I hope that maybe David will have us back in the future when we have a little more research. And I hope you guys enjoy. And these are fast. So I guess I have to exit out, right?
We see some questions coming in, right, David?
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah, there's a few questions as people are kind of maybe putting up a few others. I made a couple of notes along the way that I always kind of want to spend a few moments. I'll mention that as people might want to formulate a question, put it in the chat box. Again, you mentioned Knox. I always get excited in the mention of Knox. You know, it's a Knox Mansion in Johnstown, New York. There's actually a stone with a commemorative plaque and some trees that were planted by the Knox family at Johnson Hall, the state historic site there. And it's also a really interesting story that we won't go into right now for time, but so far as Mrs. Knox and what she was able to do with the business after the passing of her husband. Another great mention of Beech Nut, Schoharie being real close, and along the canal, close to the site. And I do want to give a shameless plug toward a program that we did with Mary Alexander from the Arkell Museum, looking at some artwork. One of those was that Amanda had used. So that's Perennial and Frame. You can find that on the Friends YouTube, as well as several of these other programs. And this one as well, barring any technical difficulties, will be up there as well. And I made a few other notes. Everything Worthy of Observation, that travel journal that was referenced, that can be found online. It's a great book, and the annotations and editing by Paul Schneider are fantastic. And from my understanding, any of the proceeds, if somebody goes online and buys that, goes to the New York State Library. So that's also a good opportunity for people to help support the work that they do. And it was to be our book club selection. We're holding off on that a little bit, and as soon as we're able to, we'll do that as our book club. So it's worthy to get a copy now and begin your reading. We'll discuss that more so far as the site. So a couple of questions. One of the ones that came in earlier was that Aaron recognized Lorenzo's kitchen, but where was the other?
The other one is, I believe it's Sackett's Harbor, which is up north. Sackett's Harbor is a battle site of the War of 1812. But the house itself is furnished to the 1860s because the family that was over the boat building, the naval station there, are actually Southerners, and so they chose to leave, and all their property was, they sided with the South, and all their property was confiscated and later sold. So we know it was in the house, so it's furnished to the 1860s. I believe that was Sackett's Harbor.
Great. And a comment that came in from Sue says that both pronunciations, Leroy and Leroy, that both of them have been heard actually by natives of that community. So
I always want to be respectful, and I've given that reference literally dozens of times, and only today questioned myself about 5 minutes before this talk about whether I was saying it correctly. So I thank you for that.
Very good. And I made another note here. There was a reference about the Dairy Association and the emergence with that in New York State, and even up not too many years ago with and currently what's going on, or actually it began again in this year with prices of milk and the Dairy Association. There's some references that I've made in another program, even within the hamlet of Fort Hunter and across New York and across the country, where there's Dairy Association and setting prices meant that dairy farmers were restricted when they were able to bring their milk to a creamery or so far as dumping their supply in order to change demand. So I thought that was really great. And it makes me also make the reference of how the Dairy Association is sort of like a milk cartel in the control of the supply. But Brian had also asked if people on the Erie Canal or within that era were possibly eating foods that we wouldn't otherwise today, sort of things that, for example, buckwheat, mutton, pigeon, and if there's anything that's specifically Erie Canal in cookbooks or from that era that you've been covering or utilizing.
I think that the basic references to eating on the Erie Canal that I have seen are fairly standard. Many people talk about basically how they are pleased with the food And I suspect it is more basic fare, for lack of a better terminology, sort of meat and potatoes kind of fare, which is similar fare that's being served in these smaller taverns throughout the Canal region. It's interesting. And I haven't seen any cookbooks. It's interesting as you get into cookbooks, and Amanda can chime in at any point, is when you start to look at cookbooks, you do find where there are certain recipes ascribed to certain places, certain people, certain locales, for better or worse. I have actually cannot think of one that sort of rises to prominence and makes it into a sort of standardized cookbook that references, you know, packet book, you know, braised beef or something like that. But Amanda might know better than I on that. I can't think of one. I mean, you have to remember these are everyday cooks cooking on everyday boats in very small quarters. These boats are only 70 feet long, and they're all the berths, everything is there. I suspect they are also provisioning themselves, as the bum boat implied, referenced by our young letter writer, with basically whatever provisions in the valley could be gotten, because also everything about food is also about economics. So when you have a certain price for board, whoever is taking in that cost for board must cover those costs by, you know, in terms of their food outlay. And so this is really different, I think, and Amanda, I promise I'll let you talk in a second, than the sort of fare you would expect on some of the grander steamboats, and certainly on the Pullman cars, and definitively in the big hotels.
Right. The one thing I was thinking of is that on, I think eating game birds was pretty standard in the 19th century, so they might have had pigeon, but and mutton, very common still too. But I do remember in Alexander Scott's journal, he mentions fishing.
Yes, I was just going to say, we thought of it at the same time. They fish off the boat and they eat it.
And they eat it. But I mean, I don't think that anybody was guaranteeing. I think that was a person who, you know, these people are on vacation. And it was a person doing that, a person riding on the boat, not someone, not a proprietor of the boat.
But interestingly,
they did eat it.
Interestingly enough, Amanda, I cut major points out of that letter, which is in the Niagara County Historical Society. That letter by that young boy to his friend back in Albany, Jim, is just a treasure trove of first account information. He actually discusses them trying to fish, meaning those who were actually working on the boat, fishing off of the side of the boat. So I do think it was fairly frequent and not an exception.
Yeah.
And remember, the whole point of this is that it is affordable travel. I think there's a sense of glamorization at some point about who's making this travel, and sort of what the accommodations were. You know, there is another account. The berths would drop down from basically the ceiling, and there is reference in one of my accounts of someone attempting the first night to sleep in the top berth, and the air quality being so bad that they decided to opt to try to get a prime placement in one of the lower berths. It was cramped quarters. Any of you that have been in a small sailboat for any period of time, you know, you know, there are reasons people are up on deck and sort of hanging out. But yeah, you know, it was beautiful and it was affordable. But people don't reference specifically, honestly, even the specifics often of what they're eating in taverns. And I urge you all to read the diary that's now going to be part of the book club, because I think what you get here is the account of a more everyday person. And unfortunately, Alexander does not reference, and Amanda and I have looked, about the specifics of what he's eating. He's just saying that he is eating, and he's saying whether it was good or bad or whether he was disappointed, but he's not really getting into the specifics of it.
Very limitedly.
I think you make a really good point about that in kind of parts of the Canal Traveler are focused on or glamorized in a certain way, and even in some of the travel writing. And I kind of liken that as to anybody that's taken a family vacation, particularly in the days now of social media. You're not posting the picture of your child having a tantrum. You're posting a picture of them smiling and having a good time. And it's sort of like, you know, being able to kind of curate, I guess, in your own family history, your own story in that way. There was a question that came in about, first off, the comment was that menus are fascinating, and that Sue mentioned she's a living history cook, interpreting 1854 to 1865, where people could access the American hotel menu.
You can literally Google. I mean, it is amazing how easy it is to find these menus online, because they're often being sold, you know, as ephemera. And so you can find many images of menus from these hotels throughout the century. And they are, I could do a whole talk on those menus and usually spend more time on them. They're fascinating. It's great to, you know, sort of meet virtually another person who kind of gets geeked out like Amanda and I about these sort of menus. And so lovely to meet you in this virtual space.
There's another question coming in from April about how recently learning that the food safety and fake food became a nationwide issue because of the lack of food labeling in the law. Do you have any comments on this in New York State at that time?
I mean, I don't know about the food labeling, but when we were talking about that consistency of product, I think they were so concerned with the sanitization of everything. So when someone says it's scientific, it's clean, they were very concerned about contamination in this time, and especially related to the canning industries. So, but also related to the dairy industry. As I said, pasteurization was constantly being worked on. And that's part of, you didn't touch on this much, Val. You usually do. We usually talk about Borden's milk.
I cut him. I cut him out.
Cut. But they actually, one of the factories in Little Falls was eventually supplying Borden's. It was sold a few times because it became popular because it was heated and couldn't and was clean, and it was better for children than regular milk.
Yes, there were canned, you know, ideas around canning and consistency of result in product were seen as scientific innovation, and people, you know, I think it's evidenced in the sort of the silver accoutrement for condensed Borden's milk that you put on your table. And there was this increased perception that these things were more sanitary. And I think in some instances that they were. I don't actually know when better codification comes in relative to these sort of food safety laws. It's actually a really interesting question and not something I have really delved into. Amanda, is that something you've really looked into at all?
No, though obviously people are still really interested in it, and I think have felt that at times it has been inadequate. But the other thing that's happening, and I think it goes hand in hand with this, and we did a whole nother talk on health trends in the 19th century. So all of this is happening at the same time. And there's tons of health trends that where people are eating vegetarian, and they're related to spiritual aspects, and then not also. And there's so many things happening at once. So those reform movements that what we see in Western New York, both abolition and the women's rights movement, are happening at the same time with a lot of religious movements and health movements. And sometimes they're interrelated. People are doing both. So it's a really fascinating century. Anyone who thinks the 19th century is boring has never studied it.
And you have some of the first publications come out. We have one in the collection at Alana of some of these very health-oriented magazines relative to food and how to eat a clean diet. And just this wound up on the cutting floor too. But one of the first vegetarian restaurant in America was actually opened by a woman, which in the 19th century, in the later 19th century. In one of the Midwestern states. I don't have that note, but so yeah, it's all sort of interconnected.
Wow. This has been extremely fascinating. I'm not saying other questions come in. There is so much that we could talk about. That I think this answered a lot of questions and brought up some more questions. And so perhaps we could figure out a way to develop a part 2 and have you both join us again.
I think that would be great, David. I think what's really interesting, and I just, Amanda made this point at the beginning, but you got a little insight tonight about what it is like sort of when you're in the middle of examining things. Many historians right now, and art historians, social historians, wherever you are in this field, in this museum or historic sites field, are really examining how to exhume these sort of other narratives and other threads. And it's work many of us are just beginning. So usually you see someone who's presenting their great fait accompli, wonderful research handed in a neat little bow, and what you're experiencing in this, and that's what Amanda and I usually do, frankly. But we thought it was interesting to sort of give a glimpse into what it means to really start examining these questions and where you go and how do you look and what sources, journals, and artworks and census records and any number of things. And so we would certainly, I think, welcome the opportunity to be invited back at any time. So, and read Paul's book. It's excellent.
Absolutely.
So good.
Thank you both again so very much. And thank you to everybody that has tuned in this evening. It's always wonderful to be able to provide this content to those folks that want to tune in. It's always great to have wonderful presenters with really wonderful information. And I don't know what else to say about that. This has just been fantastic. And I really, really do appreciate it. And thank you so much. And I look forward to part 2.
Thank you,
David.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you, everyone, for sticking around for this lively conversation. We all know that we're online a lot, and so we appreciate being something you choose to spend your Tuesday evening tuning into. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, and goodbye.